On the line with us, America's lawyer, host of Ring of Fire Radio, attorney, author, man extraordinaire, Mike Papantonio. RingofFireRadio.com is the website. Hey, Pap, great to see you again.
Tom, how are you?
I'm fine. A lot going on in the world today, and in particular, a lot going on out of Ferguson. Your thoughts on this situation?
Well, there's so many complicated parts. Right now, the most important part of that discussion seems to be that you have a prosecutor who is actually should not be involved in this case. He's a local prosecutor by the name of McCullough that is dead set on going forward with the grand jury hearings. Now, the problem with that is that he has so much impact on what that grand jury is going to do, and unfortunately his connection to the police department is overwhelmingly strong. His mother, father, brothers, sister, cousins all worked for the police department. But I think what's most troubling is the story that's emerging, where it tells a story that in the year 2000, two people were shot 21 times as they sat in their car, and they were suspected of being involved with drugs. Well, they had less than 3 ounces of drugs between them, and they were shot 21 times. This prosecutor, even before the grand jury comes out and calls them bums, he calls them dealer bums or something to that effect, and that's his right to do that. But you understand, when he appears in front of the grand jury, his job is to be as objective as he can. So he appears in front of the grand jury, and the grand jury, of course, comes back with no prosecution. What's interesting about that is that same year, just to put it into perspective, and this is pretty typical, there were 60,000 grand juries that take place, and out of the 60,000, there was only 29 that failed to come back with a recommendation of conviction. Now, why does that happen? It happens because the prosecutor has such a strong relationship with the jurors to begin with, and the prosecutor has the ability to turn things any way he wants to. If he wants a prosecution, he can get it. If he doesn't want a prosecution, he simply tweaks the witness, tweaks the forensic evidence in such a way to where the jury concludes that there's nothing happening here. This setting is a perfect example, Tom. I mean, you have there are no special set of rules, for example, that a policeman uses with the use of deadly force. It all can be synthesized down to the idea of subjective analysis, which is, of course, the officer's best call under the circumstances. So just imagine that you're a juror sitting on that panel, and you have a prosecutor in front of you. In this case, what takes place, what's presented to this jury, is that a struggle takes place inside the cabin of this patrol car. That's the first thing. That area, under the law, is considered a zone of protection for a police officer. It heightens the officer's ability to use deadly force at that point inside his police car. So if there's any struggle at all with the police in that area, felony has automatically taken place. And in this case, the struggle involved a patrolman's firearm inside that area considered the zone of protection. So what happens after that, Tom? Once a gun has been drawn out of the officer's subjective decision to protect himself, there's no requirement for the officer to draw on non-deadly, to draw down in less force. He doesn't have to move to spray. He doesn't have to use a taser. He can proceed with deadly force. So again, you have a situation that's going to be presented to this jury. A felony has arguably taken place in the car. The felony involves a firearm. The manual says that this officer is required to pursue the felon at that point. And that's where the whole issue of proximity comes into the case. The officer is going to argue that there was a turn towards him. It was sudden. Michael Brown is 6'4". The officer is trained to know, he's trained day after day to understand that a man can cover a distance of 20 feet in less than 2 seconds. So the officer has less than 2 seconds to react. Human factor science says there's no time for rational decision, and from that point, everything looks completely appropriate to a grand jury. Now, what I just gave you, understand, there would be no answer to that coming from the other side. Every one of those points is answerable. Every one of those points there's another side to. But if this prosecutor does not want a conviction, he simply argues in the same way that I just argued.
Wow. Wow. And this prosecutor, by the way, his father was killed by a black man. His father was a police officer, and he was killed by a black man. If this prosecutor was in a pool of jurors for a murder trial, and the lawyers asked the question of the potential jurors, have any of you ever had a close member of your family murdered, and particularly murdered by somebody who's African American? This man would have to raise his hand, and he would be dismissed from that jury pool, would he not?
Yeah, he would be, but those issues will never come up. Nobody's ever going to know that in the trial. This is going to come down to this, Tom, and that is whether or not it was a rational move for this police officer to have done what he did.
Right.
Did rational thought in that setting, was it replaced by panic? Was it replaced by flight or fight instincts? The officer, and here's another thing I think is most important, the officer is trained again and again to shoot for the center of the most extensive mass. Here the police officer, according to this prosecutor, in front of that DA, in front of that grand jury, the prosecutor is going to be saying that the officer actually tried to shoot Brown in the arm. They're going to add to that hyperagitation, you know, the film of him pushing the store owner. That hyperagitation becomes relevant to Brown's state of mind. That's going to be a problem. If there are any bruises or at all on this police officer, this case is winnable on both sides. But if I'm telling you that those facts that I just gave you are the facts probably that's going to be presented to this grand jury, you almost conclude, well, I don't see a possibility of a conviction.
So the prosecutor basically decides the outcome before he goes into the grand jury room.
That's exactly right.
And if he's got an axe to grind, it's going to get ground.
Well, that's correct, Tom. You know what's worse? Let's assume the grand jury does come back with an indictment, an indictment of some kind. Now a lot of things they can do that are less than an indictment, but let's say they come back with an indictment. This prosecutor then has the ability to control the pace of the trial. He can say, look, he can be in the middle of a trial. He can think, well, is second-degree murder a possibility for this officer that is with this department that I have so many attachments to? If that occurs, all he has to do is tweak a witness here, tweak forensic evidence here, and all of a sudden it moves from second-degree murder to excusable homicide. So this guy needs to move on. This grand jury should not even be hearing this. It's a local grand jury. This governor needs to show enough courage to say, hell no, you may not present this case, and this grand jury may not hear it. We're going to go out of town, way out of Ferguson.
Any thoughts on why Jay Nixon, he's a Democratic governor.
Lack of courage, absolute,
he's just
utter lack of courage. And you know the ugly part of it is at the end of this, he's going to regret it. Because if this goes bad, Mr. Nixon's going to have a hell of a lot bigger problems than what's happening in Ferguson. Yeah. Bigger problems than what's happening right now. But the man has no courage at all. All he had to do is look at the way he's handled everything up to this point. You know, how do you possibly give this prosecutor who has so much contact with this police department the choice to stay? You don't even give him that choice. You say you may not do this. It's time for you to move on.
Well, that was my point, was that the governor should be acting like the person, selecting jurors.
Of course he should. And the governor's not an idiot. You heard those facts I just gave you just then. I know I gave them to you quickly, but you get the picture of how winnable this is if you're in a setting with 12 grand jurors that you'd work with all the time. You're in front of them all the time. You have credibility with them, and you give them that story.
Wow. Mike Papantonio, host of Ring of Fire, America's Attorney, ringoffireradio.com. Pap, thanks for dropping by today.
Thank you, Tom.
It's always great talking with you. We will be back in just a moment, 15 minutes past the hour.